And we are live. JT here. Welcome to The Huddle. The Huddle is where I sit down with successful people from the world of sport and coaching. It's to learn more about their journey to greatness. Why do I have these conversations? Because success always leaves clues. I want to take a moment to thank you. I want to take a moment to thank you, whether you are tuning in live as we stream into our Facebook community, whether you are watching the replay on YouTube or on Facebook, or whether you're listening to the audio on the podcast. Thank you so much for being here with me and my special guest today. And here's my reminder to you. The mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's wide open. My challenge to you is to go all in on this conversation. Remove any distractions so you can gain a valuable nugget of wisdom. And I guarantee you that valuable nugget of wisdom will not only help you succeed in sports, but more importantly, in the game of life. Been looking forward to my conversation with my special guest today. You know, we've been talking over the last couple of months, and I've been just encouraging him. I'd love to have him come on and just share his journey to greatness. And he's been gracious to bless us with his time.
You wore me down. You wore me down, brother.
Persistence, brother, persistence. My guest in the huddle today has a number of different titles. As I was saying before he came on, he's currently serving as the defensive line coach, special teams coordinator, and recruiting coordinator at the current national champion Western Mustangs. My guest in the huddle today is Coach Kevin MacNeill. How are you today, brother?
Good. More Hulk Hogan brothers out there for me.
Exactly. Before we get kicked off, pun intended, I just like to remind our audience that, one of my daily practices, which help remind me to be here and now, is to count my blessings. And I'm a firm believer the biggest blessing we can give anyone is our time and energy. So I just want to thank you again for blessing me with some of your time and energy into being here with me and our community today. And thanks again. Appreciate it, brother.
My pleasure, man.
Okay. So one of the first things I'd like to do in the huddle is to remind people that life is a game and games are supposed to be fun. So I'm curious, what is an interesting fact? I had a coaching colleague and a great friend that said, we all have our quirks. We all have those things that make us unique and different. I'm curious, what's maybe an interesting fact? Maybe some would call it a quirk that maybe a lot of people don't know about you that you'd be open to sharing with our community.
Well, geez, man, I don't know about that. I like fishing. I think most people know that about me, but yeah. There you go.
So I'm curious, what is it about fishing? Like I grew up, I remember my dad used to take our family fishing. What is it? I'm curious, like, what is it about fishing that like brings you that sense of joy?
Like growing up, like I was the youngest to my brother and my cousins, and they're all better at fishing than me. So I didn't like fishing, because I wasn't winning it. The games were supposed to be fun. I thought you meant games were supposed to be won, but once I stopped playing football, I needed something else. Like I needed something in my life to compete at and to kind of fill that void. And so obviously coaching was a big part of that. But I started fishing a lot more once I finished playing. And that was just something to try to excel at and be good at, which was kind of helped with that process of transitioning from playing to the real world.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. And what I really heard from you there is just that idea of like, it just kind of allowed you to sort of scratch that itch a little bit, right? That sort of fire inside of you that just likes to grow and get better at things.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm curious, it's very evident that sport has played an important role in your life, right? You were, again, a high level athlete, right? Who, again, very decorated from an individual standpoint, right? Recognized both provincially and at the national level. And then you transitioned into coaching and have done it at a high level for many years. I'm curious, what is a lesson that you've gotten in sport that you still find yourself applying to your life today?
A lesson in sport, I mean, there's so many, I mean, like, you know, you can choose from a ton of different options there. But I mean, like, chase your dreams. I mean, like that's I was talking to former teammate of mine, this morning about this. Chase your dreams, but have a backup. You know what I mean? Like, chase your dreams and shoot for the stars, but make sure you have a backup plan. And the lesson I learned, because I didn't, I didn't really have much of a backup plan. I was just all in for playing. And when that didn't happen, I was like, well, I'll just go on in coaching, and kind of it just worked out. But it's important to shoot for the stars and chase your dreams, but make sure you have a fail safe just in case.
Yeah. Now I'm curious again, anyone that knows you, I love that idea of being all in, right? Like, go all in on your dreams. Now I'm curious, is that something that came naturally to you, or was there like a particular, coach, teacher, a parent, a loved one that sort of shared that idea with you?
No, I think I kind of learned along the way. Like, one of my best friends in university kind of was a big, goal chaser and dream chaser kind of thing. And we had that in common, and that kind of what, brought us together as friends. So, that was kind of big, but it was really like, football was just that outlet, for me, that I needed as a young man to, kind of get some aggression out and not get in trouble for it. So, it went on to some pretty cool things with it and get a great degree and a great career. But chasing those dreams and those goals, just kind of, manifested itself along the way,
And I love that, right? Like, I love that, you're acknowledging all these blessings that have come along the way, right? Like these friendships, the degree, right? All these connections you've created. And it really reminds me of this idea, people often talk about, the beauties in the destination, right? It's in that process. And it's interesting that, I go back to this analogy that, a ship, like let's say a cruise ship, it knows where it wants to go. It knows its next port of call. And it's funny, it won't see that port of call for like 99% of the journey, but it's through its ability to keep moving through the water, right? Sometimes it's calm, sometimes it's rocky, that it actually gets to its destination. So kudos to you for seeing that, like, the joy really is in the journey.
Yeah. It was funny. I remember sitting down on Gary Jeffries. He was the defense coordinator at Laurie at the time, on his couch. And he's like, so what do you want to do? And I was like, well, I want to play on specials my first year, try to become a starter. I want to, then start for the next 4 years and, become an all-star and, playing championships and, all this kind of stuff. And after like, probably 10 or 15 minutes of me going on and on, he goes, no, I meant, like, do you want to go for lunch? And so that's a fond memory of, a guy who had a big influence in my life.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious, you talked about this idea of, going all in on your dreams, but acknowledging that every journey, right? It's like reading a chapter, it's like reading a book, right? Every chapter ends and new one begins. So I'm curious for you, do you remember when you decided, okay, I'm going to transition from being an athlete to a coach, what was the inspiration to do that? Because, getting to know you, I believe you could be successful in whatever you chose to do. What was the inspiration to get into coaching?
I always wanted to coach. I mean, like that was something at a young age. When I started, first watching football, and I always wanted to, like, I'm going to play for as long as I can and try to go pro. There was always kind of with the mindset, like, try to get that on the resume to make it as a coach. And back when I started, there wasn't a lot of full-time coaching jobs, so it was very much like, it was a tough kind of thing to get into. Coaching wise, getting that full-time job. So I always kind of had that as like my, like, background is like, I want to play as long as I possibly can. Yeah. And then, when that's over, if I can make a living at coaching, I'll do that, and if I can't, I kind of had a few different, knucklehead ideas in my head of things to do. But really it was kind of like, kind of part of my makeup going, from a young age. I remember drawing up plays as a kid, when I was 13 years old kind of thing. But yeah. So it's always kind of been a part of me. So.
Okay. Well, you bring up an interesting idea, right? Like anyone that would look at you today, right, and say, okay, here is a coach, a prominent coach at the national champion. It looks like, he has everything put together. But as you said, what I really got from your journey there is that there have been lots of focus reps and sets, right? Like you had to pay a price to get into coaching, right? Like you said, there weren't a lot of full-time coaching jobs when you first got into it. So I'm curious from your perspective, what was the biggest lesson you've learned over your coaching career? Being at different opportunities and just sort of navigating this journey from not a lot of opportunity to where you are today.
Well, you kind of said it a little bit. Enjoy the process. Enjoy the people you work with. Especially in university coaching, we put a lot of hours. You want to spend those time with people that you appreciate. And that can challenge you and you can learn from, and that's and that you can trust. I think that's the biggest thing is that, you don't want to be, looking over, you're putting in a lot of hours, you don't want to be looking over your back. Right. So, I think that was a big, I kind of, didn't really realize that at the beginning, because when I first started coaching, at Laurier, it was an incredible environment, 4 years as an assistant at Laurier. When I first started out, it was amazing. It was such a camaraderie. We were winning too, which always, makes things better, but, it was an amazing group of people, and that's really made it that much more special.
It's funny as you say that, right? Like I know getting to know you, you're big on surrounding yourself with great people, right? Like a strong and powerful team, right? Like any high level athlete and coach knows. And it's funny, it reminds me of our conversation as we were planning this year for Red Black Weekend. And I remember you would say, like, we're in a quote unquote serious logistics meeting. You're like, most important question, is there great food there? And I just remember thinking, what a great way to just kind of like remind us that, really is about like people. It's breaking bread. It's these connections, right? It's these moments of just connecting with a human being that really make the journey worthwhile.
Yeah. We gotta have good food.
Yeah. So I'm curious here. So, one thing I've definitely come to appreciate about you again is your love of people. And again, having some athletes, which we both work with, that's one thing that always seems to be the feedback, is they always have great things to say about you, right? Like there seems to be this connection that they really enjoy. Like, was that something that a particular coach, like I know you mentioned Coach Jeffries, early in your university career, was it a group of coaches? Was it one coach that really taught you this idea that, you really win with people?
Well, I'm sure not everyone says good things. Okay. But Ron Van Morker, was my position coach and longtime defense coordinator at Laurier. Huge impact in my life. Still very close friends. Also Gary Jeffries. Stephen Patask was part of that staff. That great person. So a lot of great people along the way. A lot of great people. It's amazing now to be at Western, and we have an incredible defensive staff that is just so much. We have a ton of fun together, and it's great to be around those guys. So it's fun going in the office when you have that kind of thing. But those early days, Coach Smith, Coach Jeffries, Coach Van Worker had really big impacts on me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, right? Again, it's that people first, right? Like it's got to be fun. Like you mentioned earlier, we put a lot of time and energy into this, so it's got to be fun, right? Going back to life's a game. Games are supposed to be fun. I'm curious, how important has that been, right? Because I feel like as a Western alum, it's been amazing to see the last 5 years, because you've seen that it is now it's always been a destination, but now I feel it's like Western's kind of put itself back at the top of the mountain. How important has that been in there, like to make the process more enjoyable? Because there's I feel like just being around, there's been a different energy the last few years. Like it seems to be one where you guys are having a ton of fun, both players and coaches.
Yeah, unless the D line doesn't get to the quarterback on game day, and that's not so much fun. But ultimately it's we don't talk about winning a ton. Like Coach Marshall doesn't talk about winning. It's about just doing things the right way and being respectful and inclusive, and that's one of the things that is nice to be a part of. It's very family oriented, where the kids and the wife are welcome in the stadium anytime, and always chocolate bars, in Coach Marshall's office for the kids, and so that kind of stuff is fun. Like we do. I think there's a lot of mutual trust, and I think we're all there for the right reasons too, and we all just enjoy going to the office. So yeah, it's been a great experience. It's been an incredible learning experience. Learning a ton every single day from Coach Marshall. Like he's the best, and it's been incredible to kind of get to see him, and how he operates.
I love that, right? Again, this environment, right, where it's inclusive, right? Like everyone's welcome. Like that's it to me, it makes it feel like everyone's a part of this, right? Everyone's a part of this process. You brought up an interesting idea, and it's interesting how, I'm a firm believer life is all divine timing. I actually posted a conversation I had with Coach Demore about this idea of like great leaders focus on building trust. So I'm curious from your perspective, you've mentioned that word a number of times. Is there anything that you do? Because again, you've mentioned several times it's important to you. I can tell. Is there something that you do when working with other athletes, coaches, in terms of building that trust, building that connection with them? Is there anything that you do in that process?
I think it just comes from learned experiences, right? You just the more you work with someone and can learn to depend upon them, I mean, you start to build that. Like players is a funny one, like players is every kid's a little bit different, and you kind of have to approach each athlete a little bit different, but ultimately they're not going to really truly listen to what you say until they learn to trust you and know that you have their back, right? So so that's important, for that process. It doesn't happen right away. It takes, some time. It took some time with a few of my guys, but we got, and I think, we're so close now because of it. And also, getting to share in the success of last, year's team was pretty special. So, yeah, these shared experiences is so important. I mean, like that's, it's, you can't just, trust in something that's not, truly given. Like it has to be earned. And I think that's one of the things that we've kind of gone through.
And it's a great reminder. I know, again, many of the great coaches, great leaders, that I've chatted with in the huddle have all talked about like one of the first things they do. It is about, building those bridges of trust, right? Like it takes some time, right? And it all comes back to this idea that like when people genuinely believe that you have their best interests at heart, that's where you can actually get the most out of them and actually help them achieve their goals faster and with greater ease.
Yeah, and it's like if you don't enjoy watching someone, the light bulb come on for a player and watching them, develop and grow and be successful, you shouldn't coach, right? Like that's the part, that's why we do it, is to see those successes, those individual successes, that all come together for a team game, is really, it's a lot of fun, right? So that's the that's the fun part of what we do.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like seeing the wins, seeing other people's wins as the collective win, right? Like other people's wins are your wins and vice versa.
Well, that's the thing, right? Start teaching these guys how to, make these, put these things into practice, the skills that you're trying to teach them, then it's successful. You can see them then do that with the rest of things in their life, right? It's not, it all bleeds into each other, where they'll start, maybe I'll put a little more time studying and then get, good mark on the test, same thing. They'll put a little more study in my playbook, I'm going to do a better job on the football field. So it's all connected, right? So it's nice to see when players start to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm curious again, you've been coaching for a while as well. So I'm just curious, obviously we live in an interesting time, right? Our world now is designed to where more of our communication is technology based, right? It's through phones. I'm curious from your lived experience, do you find that building trust, although the principles are the same, do you feel like it takes more time, it takes less time? Like what has been your experience, creating these authentic connections?
I mean, like in today's world, is just like, you have so much more connection, right? There's so much more connection where, I remember when I played, like you didn't see your coach, that often in the off season, right? Now we see each other all the time. So you have, more opportunities to either, gain trust or lose trust, so there's a lot more connection that way. So whether that's good or bad, it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things that is interesting in today's world. Kids are smarter. Like kids are so much, they have so much more access to information. They go on YouTube and they see this and see that, and they come to it with, I remember when I was playing, we didn't know anything. You had your coach was the expert because there's nowhere else you could go.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, challenging in some aspects, but at the same time, you can get so much more done because you have so much more connection and you're dealing with a smarter player.
I love that for a couple of reasons, right? Like you talked about, it's really an opportunity, right? What you choose to do with that opportunity, with those connection points, is completely in your control. And what it reminded me as well is that, people access to information is so much greater these days. And I think it goes back to the idea that this is actually where I think it's important to remind ourselves that you're always making people feel something, right? Like you are either making them feel like that they can trust you or the opposite. So it's kind of really interesting how we're more connected, but again, you always get to choose, what they feel in that opportunity, right?
Well, yeah, and there's higher expectations with the more connection, right? The more you see the player, the higher the expectations kind of go in terms of their conduct, because you're always with them, you're always around them, right? So so there's a bit of that, you have to have a little bit of understanding with that too. It's like, well, if this was 20 years ago, would you be as mad at the player for missing something that you probably wouldn't even known he was missing 20 years ago, right? So try to deal with it a little bit of understanding and compassion when you as much as you can.
I love that. You talk about this idea of perspective, right? The importance of that mental muscle, right? Perception, like being able to see the world through the lens of someone else, like that compassion and understanding. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how important are those skills if you're coach, if you're leading others, the ability to actually practice patience, to actually practice compassion and understanding for others? Like, how important is that in today's world, especially working with young people today?
Well, you want to see patience. You see me drive in downtown Toronto during rush hour. There's not a lot of patience going on there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all, it's what you make of it, like, you can, each perspective brings a different, ingredient with it. Right. So, being patient is great in some situations, others not. Right. So, it's one of the things, when you're trying to build trust, you always try to, give the player the benefit of the doubt as much as you can until you can't, and I think that's where, the patient piece comes into it. But at the same time, certain guys will take it and run with it and abuse that trust, right? So yeah, it depends upon per kid and per person, right?
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like this idea of it's not going to be a perfect journey, right? Like there's going to be bumps along the way. There's going to be ebbs and flows. So really just understanding that it always could come back to a teachable moment.
Yeah. I mean, that's what you try, right? That's what, as coaches, we're trying to, teach, not just on-field skills, but life skills, and, our players go on to be great husbands and fathers and members of their communities. Right. So like, that's really, at the end of the day, football is a very small part of their lives. There's so much more after, for our guys, and that's really why we do what we do, is we want to see guys be successful in their lives once they're done football.
Yeah. It's funny. It goes back to, I think back to, when we were in university, that idea where OUA, the champions for life, right? And it's really that idea that that's what it sounds like to you. That's the driver for you, is to use football is just the vehicle. It's the tool to help teach greater skills so they can grow up to be great husbands, great men, right? And just great leaders in the game of life.
That's what you hope for, that's what you hope for. Win some championships along the way. But, no, absolutely. It's, that's the best thing, is seeing your players go on and do great things.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious again, you're a London guy. What has it been like being part of this, building this rock solid foundation, right? Like Western's always, had a strong tradition, but I really do feel the last 5 years have really kind of have ushered in a new era. Every era is, unique and different. But what has that been like being a London guy, helping to create this, I don't know, this new era of Western football where, the expectation, okay, I know you said Coach Marsh stood up to win it, but it's Vanier Cups. It's playing for Vanier Cups and winning Vanier Cups. What's that been like for you?
Well, I spent the majority of my career trying to get guys to leave London. London's a hotbed of football. Now it's hey, stay home, save some money. But being from London, and I truly think that it is the best football city in Canada. For talent, and it's just a remarkable place to play high school football. I love high school football in London. I love the high school football rivalries, and go Rams. But it's special to kind of be a part of that. I love going to the fall games. I love going to South, and sitting underneath the oak tree and watching those games. So there's a lot of great memories of being on the hill at Lucas and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's special to be a part of a great football city, to be a part of that, myself, and to then see the successes of the generation now that's coming up is exceptional, right? It's amazing to see. And so it's special to be a part of it. It's nice that things are going well at Western too, but each year's a new year. You can't bank on the past successes. A lot of hard work and a lot of right kind of things to go right, to get to be successful. So every year you got to work at it.
Okay. I love that idea of you sharing, right? Because you are part of the fabric of London football, right? Like you've been there, you've done that. And that's where I always comes back to this word. I remember Coach Taylor would always share with us at Western, like you pay homage to the past, right? And one thing I've really come to appreciate about you, Coach, is this idea of, when we were planning for Red Black, you're like, what could we do to integrate everyone, right? Like what could we do to engage the high schools, right? What could we do to the London Junior Stangs, right? The Beefeaters, right? And just make this about Team Ontario, but make this a community. So I'm curious here, coming out of these last 2.5 years, which has been an interesting experience for all of us, how important is that to build sort of from the grassroots all the way to the top, if we truly want to share this beautiful game with more people?
Well, you mentioned it, and I want to make sure I give a shout out, to the volunteers from the Junior Mustangs, from the London Beefeaters, for their help with the red light. Like that event, was made so much better by so many people that helped out through, equipment to, sorting out jerseys and rosters on game day. Incredible, the amount of support, that we have locally, with our local, parents. It's we're nowhere near as successful as we are without them. So going to grad, I'm a big believer in high school football. I think high school football is so important. It attaches an education piece to it too, and there's teachers involved with it. And I think that's one of the things that I think makes university football special, is because has an academic piece attached to it as well. So I think that goes hand in hand. But grassroots, I think football is one of those sports that has a lot of transferable skills, where you can play baseball and basketball and all these sports as a kid, and should play a lot of different sports as a kid, and they all these skills all translate well to football. So I think growing the grassroots is important at the high school level, but I think making sure that we're providing lots of opportunities for guys to play all different sports, and enjoy competing different times of the year for different sports is so important.
Yeah, no, and I love that you're bringing up this idea of so many things go behind the scenes, right? And I think about even just what I loved about Red Black Weekend, we're just using that as an example, was what a great experience, right? Like how many athletes, how many parents, how many community members came up after and just said, that was amazing, right? And again, you were a big part of that. I know it's, I said that to you that week, and yes, we had many volunteers that helped it. And it was interesting because I know when we first chatted about it, it was like, you have this big vision, right? We had to, sort of create this great vision of what it could be like that weekend. But then actually seeing it manifest, come to fruition, and seeing everyone just have a great experience and just seeing how much joy was there. That to me was the most rewarding part of the weekend, was just seeing what's possible when we all work together and move in the same direction together.
Yeah, and it was nice to get some sunshine too, right? Like if it had rain, it would have been a terrible weekend. No, it was a lot of fun, getting that thing.
Okay. So I'm curious, so this game is growing, right? If you look at participation numbers, you look at retention rates, right? We have more people playing here, at least if specifically we're playing in Ontario. There's more pathways, right? Between tackle, flag. We have, many more pathways here. We have new parts of our population that are being introduced, whether it's BIPOC, whether it's females, right? Even the tech side you're starting to see come in. What, from your lived experience, what do you see as kind of like the next logical step in order for us to continue to grow the game, to share these beautiful life lessons that are so built into our game?
Yeah, that's a big question. I don't know. I need to. That's if I knew that, then I'd be making a lot more money maybe. But
yeah.
I like for me, I think competition is critical, and I think we've seen that in the OUA. I think there's a lot more competition. Teams are games are close. Games are close, and everyone, every single university team is working hard. 20 years ago, it wasn't really the case. There's some teams that were recruiting, and some teams were kind of recruiting, and some teams were just like down to Florida. So I think now what you see a lot of great coaches, working extremely hard at all the different institutions and are having big impacts at, driving success there. And I think the games are close, the games aren't real, huge blowouts anymore. And I think that's good for the game. I think it's good for the sport. I think trying to achieve that at all levels, the high school level, all the way down, you want good competitive games because, no one wants to be no one wants to be on the receiving end of a blowout, and that's what turns people off the sport. If they're just always getting, beat every single, by 70 points, that's not a fun experience, and I think, football is the most inclusive sport. I think it's the most diverse sport, from a multiple different areas, but especially just from, body type and athletic ability. You have giant guys, you have little guys, like in every kind of role in between. And I think that's, really unique in our sport and something that should be celebrated, that it is one of the most inclusive sports I think in this country.
Yeah, no, and I love that you share that, right? Two things I really loved about what you shared. At first you talked about this idea of like, let's make this experience great for everyone, right? And it's funny that sometimes I remember my last couple of years of high school, when we're trying to create schedule, I just said, you know what, us, and I'm just speaking from Lucas' perspective, we just want to play meaningful football games. We will play anyone. We just want to make it because it's a good opportunity for athletes, coaches, and to do that. And I found those were actually the most rewarding games. Whether we won, whether we lost, it was just like, if it made us better and we grew as a group, great. And I really love that idea as well, that you said there's so many built-in lessons of how to be more inclusive, how to be more how to celebrate, our diverse lived experience, right? And to promote more equity just within the game, because like you said, it's so, you have all body types, all genders, right? It's just, yeah. So I love everything you shared there.
Yeah, I think it's, you got dumb guys like me and smart guys, like you got all kinds of different people, being involved, and growing up for me, it was one of the most affordable ones where you weren't having to buy your own equipment. You got equipment and then gave it back. So it was one of those things that I felt like it was even across class lines that it brought everyone together. To the poor. So I always thought that was kind of a key element of this game, and something we should definitely strive to keep it that way.
It's great that I love that you provide that reminder, right? Of football. I agree from an investment standpoint of time and energy, and I put money into the energy piece. There is such a great So it's the most affordable. When I look at like high school football, you're practicing 90 days a year, a few $100 investment, and for what they get out of it. And the best part too is I think it attracts, like you said, as you know, a different personality. Sometimes they need football more than football needs them, but it keeps them on a path to maybe it's the path that helps them graduate high school, whether it's gets them to university or whatever, just gets them to the next stage of life, right?
Absolutely, for sure. Keeps out of trouble. So that was important for a lot of high school.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm curious, brother. Again, we're entering an interesting period here, right? July, as we were talking about before, it gets a little bit quieter. I'm curious, what's next? What's next for you and Western football as we fast approach the summer?
We do work all summer, but the summer months are for our guys to make some money and take a bit of a break and continue to train and be ready for the season. But give it a little bit of a pause and then get things ramped up in August. But I think right now it's important our players get a lot of family time, get some relaxation in, and recharge and be ready to go for August.
Mm-hmm. More importantly, you get a little bit of fishing time.
Yeah, heading to Algonquin next week.
Okay. So I am curious, Coach, again, if as I said, Western has come back. It's always been a destination of choice. If anyone watching this, listening to this, has any questions about Western, wants to connect with you, learn more about the program, or simply just to connect with you, what's the easiest way to do so?
Email, email or reach out to us on social media. That's probably better. But do some research, first, understand, the academic programs and strengths of Western, make sure that it's first and foremost, your right academic fit. And, shoot me an email. We'd love to, hear from you, and anyone that emails us gets a reply. That's one thing that we're pretty passionate about. Anyone that emails the program, we'll get a reply. So feel free to drop us an email and send us any highlight film and kind of information about yourself, and we'll see if it's a good fit.
Awesome. I love it. So, Coach, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge you. I want to take a moment to acknowledge you for the man you are, the great husband, the great dad, teacher, coach, mentor, more importantly, the great human being you are. The one thing I've really come to admire about you is just how much you love on people, right? Like you are just so committed to building trust and relationships with people. And it's really been a great reminder for me about this idea of you really win with people in the game of life. So thank you for, again, being a shining light. Thank you for providing me that reminder about loving on people.
All right.
Okay, folks. So Coach MacNeill dropped so many valuable nuggets of wisdom that will not only help you succeed on the football field, but more importantly, in the game of life. But as I remind you every time in the huddle, knowledge is potential power. It's the consistent and focused application of that great knowledge that actually creates great results. So my challenge to you is to take one of these valuable nuggets of wisdom and go apply it to your life today. And as I remind you every week in the huddle, you are deserving of greatness. You are worthy of greatness. You are greatness. And my only ask from these conversations is that if it resonates with you, please share the conversation with someone special in your life. The more people we have hearing and learning and applying these simple ideas, the more people will be reaching their next level of greatness. As always, I love having these conversations. Have a blessed start to your weekend, and we'll chat with you next time in the huddle. Have a great day, everyone.